Good morning, everybody. My name is Beth Brady, and I am the strategic advisor to the We Are All Human organization and the chairman of their advisory board. My day job is I'm CMO with Chief Outsiders, which is a fractional CMO organization that helps businesses, small and large, with their strategic endeavors. I'm here filling in for Claudia this week and for the near future. As many of you know, her mom is suffering from COVID, and Claudia is doing what she needs to do to take care of her mother and her family. So I will be filling in and moderating this panel and additional webinars that we have during the week. So let's get at it. We have a really great group here that's a reoccurring group. I'm going to run through the list of people that we've got. And then, as the format has been all of the time, each of our attendees on this panel will provide you some information on what's going on with regard to COVID, particularly as it relates to the economic situation, the health situation, and specifically with Hispanics. So today we have Dr. David Nabarro, who's a special envoy of the World Health Organization. We have Jillian Tett, who's the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large U.S. Financial Times. We have Bret Stephens, who is the op-ed columnist for the New York Times. We have Fred Kempe, who is the CEO of the Atlantic Council. We have Cristina Antelo, who is the principal of Ferox Strategies. Jesus Montes, who is the managing partner at IBM. And Ramiro Cavazos, who is president and CEO of United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So a really great group to talk to us all up today about what is going on with regard to COVID here and now. So to start with, I'm going to shoot it over to Michelle Cooperwriter, who is, of course, on our staff and our team, and she will kick off with a message from Dr. David Nabarro.
Hi, guys. I'm going to start this video. I will say, as we're all learning Zoom, learning video tech, conference, everything like that, he got a little fun with his background. It might have impacted his bandwidth slightly, so the quality isn't 100%, but he has a great message, so I'm gonna get that started now.
Hello, this is David Nabarro here, greeting you once again and thanking you so much for all you are doing individually and together as we try to get on top of and ahead of this virus throughout our world. And really, we are talking about our world. Right now, more than half the world's population is living under conditions of lockdown. We're seeing that when we stop moving and stop connecting with each other, that the virus appears to spread much less speedily across our nations and in our communities. But at the same time, as I've said to you before, and I want to repeat it again, this virus is not going to go away. The epidemic curves will come down, which means the numbers of people with the disease and dying of the disease will reduce. So my first message today is we all have to be making sure that our societies and our communities are ready and on the alert for new outbreaks of COVID-19. And if we can close those outbreaks down quickly by finding the people who've got the disease and making sure they're isolated quickly, preventing them from transmitting it to others, and finding anybody else who they've been connected with and checking that they haven't got the disease and can't transmit it, if we can do all that, interrupt transmission as soon as it starts up, then we can go about our lives in the assurance that we are able to spot COVID and to prevent outbreaks from developing. And so it puts a huge obligation on all of us involved in healthcare to do everything we can to keep everyone safe and free from this infection. And if we have the defenses in place in our communities, then we don't need to resort to more lockdowns, certainly not national lockdowns. If we need them, they'll be quite localized where transmission is discovered. There are really only two things that will make it possible for us to stop worrying about COVID. The first is if we've got a fabulous treatment that's low cost, that everybody can have, that will prevent them from getting sick or dying as a result of this disease. The second is if we've got a vaccine that can be given to everybody that will enable them to be immune to the disease. Now, we do not have a universal treatment. We do not yet have a vaccine that is tried and tested and safe and that can be given to everybody. And honestly, we do not know when these things are going to come. So that's why I'm saying to everybody, get COVID ready and think hard about how you can keep yourself, your family, your loved ones, those you care for, really safe in the face of this threat. I pick on a couple of things that are troubling me a lot right now. The first is the impact of lockdowns on people, particularly poorer people, people who are in the informal sector, people who are on daily wages, people who are doing multiple jobs in order to try to make ends meet and suddenly find that the cash has stopped coming in. I think we need to recognize how much people are hurting and suffering because of the efforts that have to be put in place while we build up public health defenses to be strong in the face of future COVID outbreaks. And that sacrifice is huge. So I'm saying, let's make sure we find people who are poor, who are hurting as a result of the lockdowns, make sure that they get all the protection they can so that they can continue to have the cash they need to buy food, to look after their children, to look after their relatives, to move around for essential purposes. Let's make sure that they don't suffer as a result of the lockdowns. This is a big challenge for hundreds of millions of people all over our world. My second worry continues to be health workers. Health workers who are working so hard trying to make sure that people who've got COVID and other conditions are able to stay alive and stay well. Health workers need protection. They need personal protective equipment. So let's protect the protective equipment for the health workers so they can be kept safe. My last point, I know that many of us are now thinking that as we go about our lives, particularly as lockdowns are removed, we need to provide some sort of face covering for ourselves and for those we love. We shouldn't take the precious special masks away from health workers, but there are now some very good designs available for masks that you can develop yourself or you can get a tailor to prepare for you that give some protection if you fear you might have COVID when you might infect others, and also can have some reduction in the degree to which you're infected. And so with that, I wish you well. I commit to do everything I can as a public health leader to make sure that everybody, everywhere, is treated equally and fairly as they try to do their best to fight against this disease and any other health threats. We health people, we work very closely together, and we're part of a common family that works for the good of humanity. You, all of you, in the broad Hispanic community, do so much to care for others. It's in your DNA. You do it all the time. I salute you. Please keep it up. And with that, I say thank you, and I hope you have a good meeting.
All right. All right, a great message from Dr. David Nabarro. So with that, I'm gonna move it over to Bret Stephens, who is the op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Bret, your thoughts. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, excuse me.
There.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
I'm not going to try to add to anything that David said, which I thought was very valuable. And of course, he is the acknowledged expert in his field. I just want to make a few points on some broader ramifications of COVID, which affect everyone, whether they are directly touched by the disease or not. I said the last time we met that I see this in a similar way to the Fukushima disaster of 9 years ago. That is to say, first there's a tsunami and then there's a nuclear meltdown. The tsunami, of course, is the healthcare crisis and the toll that has exacted in human life and the strain on our healthcare system. The nuclear meltdown is what is happening to the global economy. All of you were no doubt aware that yesterday, incredibly, oil prices dipped below zero. That has everything to do with the fact that economic activity throughout the world has plummeted in a way that nobody has seen in over a century, and that is to say, including the beginning of the Great Depression in the United States in 1929. The factors involving oil also have to do with overproduction by Russia and Saudi Arabia, and lack of adequate storage capacity. But the driving factor is that decline in demand, and that's reflected in other common measures. One story I just saw this morning, which I think is very telling, is that demand for Coca-Cola products, fairly basic, have themselves declined by a staggering 25%. We're not talking about high-end goods like iPhones or iPads, talking about something fairly basic. So what we are witnessing now is economic destruction on a scale that few of us could imagine. And this destruction, I think, it's important to point out, is going to be happening globally. I grew up in Mexico City, in El DF, and so I've always been very keen to follow what is happening in Mexico itself. In just the last few days, Pemex was downgraded. Fitch downgraded the Mexican economy. Remittances from the United States, which are such an important part of Mexico's livelihood, are also not arriving. The country faces a crisis in that I don't think that the disease is being taken seriously enough by some of the health officials who are in charge of it, along with some very influential individuals there. So the effects on what is happening in Mexico and more broadly in Latin America, both from a public health standpoint and from an economic standpoint, are fairly staggering. Here in the United States, the news is that it looks like the Senate, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, the Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate, seem to be on the eve of arriving at a new agreement, $450 billion of aid for small businesses. Some $350 billion of that would go to paycheck protection. Now, this seems like a great deal of money, but I would have everyone listening in on this call be mindful of one thing. On April 2nd, that is to say 19 days ago, the Senate agreed to a $2.2 trillion relief packet, including $310 billion in paycheck protection, so nearly the equivalent amount. The United States has run through that money, $310 billion, in less than 3 weeks. So the speed with which these funds are depleting is genuinely frightening, and I dare say it's actually completely unsustainable, which raises questions about how long politically lockdowns can be sustained, even if, and I hope this is not the case, even if we don't see the kind of declines in infectivity, disease, and case fatality that all of us would wish to see. And that's manifesting itself in political rallies and kind of a populist revolt throughout the country. Final piece of news, which I think is massively important, is Donald Trump's order on what legal basis I'm not entirely sure, but at least it comes from a tweet last night and is apparently going to be turned into an executive order to halt all immigration. This is not being done, at least as far as we know, for the sake of public health, or at least in the name of public health, as was done last month or the month before, March or February, with the various travel bans vis-a-vis China and Europe. This is done explicitly on a protect American jobs basis, or so the president claims, which tells you something very worrying about the general ideological drift of the United States and other places around the world, as people imagine that they can rescue their own economies at the expense of other people, or that immigration somehow takes away from an economy rather than contribute to it. That's obviously something that particularly affects the Hispanic community, and something that I think the Hispanic community ought to mobilize strongly against, not only in terms of the community's self-interest, but more broadly in America's self-interest. I'll conclude with this. Natural disasters are bad, but the political disasters that follow are often worse. And there's relatively little that most of us, except maybe Dr. Nabarro, can do when it comes to taking action on the public health front. But there is a lot that all of us can do when it comes to taking action on the political front, and also I would add the moral front. One thing, I said this last time, but I'll say it again, there are 20 million undocumented workers, give or take, in the United States. These are the people who are most at risk, most exposed to the economic fallout, most likely to be living from one paycheck to the next. And the more that can be done to mobilize awareness of the vulnerability of this community, which has contributed so much to America's well-being and contributes so much to the well-being of the Americas as a whole, I think is extraordinarily important. I'm going to be writing about this in my own columns in the New York Times, and anything that can be done to bring attention to this extraordinarily vulnerable and precious community, I think is very important. So with that, I'll finish, and thank you for including me in this wonderful session. I'm honored to be in such distinguished company.
All right, thank you so much, Bret, and thank you for those comments. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more from some of the other panelists today on some of those topics, particularly the last one you touched on, which of course we're all greatly concerned about, is the well-being of particularly the most vulnerable in our society. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna ask Fred to give us his thoughts for this week with regard to the topics at hand.
I want to make sure that I'm heard. Am I off mute?
You are good. We can hear you.
Great. Thank you. So let me pick up on what Bret was talking about and carry it a step further. We've been looking at two things at the Atlantic Council with great focus. One of them is the geopolitics of COVID-19, and the second is the post-COVID world and what it might look like, and how do we help shape that world. I'll touch briefly on Latin America. We have an Adrian Arst Latin America Center. We hosted the president of Colombia last week, Duque. We're hosting Guaido of Venezuela this week. And so the nice thing about being virtual is you can have these kinds of meetings and reach people all over the world. On the geopolitics, I've been looking at, also in my CNBC columns, I've been looking at the coming race for global growth. And it started already. It seems odd to focus on it at this point because of the numbers that we just heard last week from the IMF in terms of projections. But the race between China and the United States could have a geopolitical impact that's lasting in terms of shaping the future of the world. So last week, the IMF, the World Bank, reported that they projected that we'd have a 3% decline in global growth this year. That hasn't happened since the 1930s. And if you consider that a 2% growth globally is considered a recession, then 3% really hurts. And that includes a 7.5% decline in the European Union this year, and more than 6% in the United States. In Europe, it could actually hurt the integrity of the European Union as a political project, as French President Macron said last week to the Financial Times. So there's an existential issue where countries that have been hit hard, Spain, Italy, have been relying more on China than they have been on the European Union for both medical supplies, but also some financial relief. When this all settles in, what will that do to the shape of the European Union? I don't think it will collapse, but European citizens will ask themselves, well, what's the European Union for? It could lose some of its relevance on the world stage. If you look at the contest between China and the United States, you would think that the United States has built-in advantage. The dollar in terms of a reserve currency still underpins 4/5 of global supply chains. The Chinese yuan only makes up 2% of global payments. The dollar accounts for roughly 2/3 of foreign reserves. But China has some advantages that it's showing in this situation. One of them is it's the first mover coming out of this, and so it's projected actually to have 1% growth by the end of the year. One has to be careful about statistics about Chinese growth for sure, but there's no doubt that East Asia is going to come out of this, if any region in the world, with just a little bit of growth. That could make a geopolitical difference. They also have 3 advantages: as a trusted debtor, an attractive creditor, and a tech partner, interestingly enough. So China has a $13 trillion bond market. It's the world's 2nd largest. And in the first quarter, the Chinese debt returned 1.3%. So that wouldn't sound so good, but in terms of the world and looking at the world and even looking at the dollar, that's pretty good. And there was a 15.5% decline of other emerging markets. And so during that period, the first quarter, China added over $8 billion in net inflows. As a creditor, it remains willing and available to help people through this period of time, including its willingness to back a G20 deal to suspend bilateral loan repayments by poorer countries. In a way, it was shunned into that. If all the other countries go along with this, then China must as well. But China loses from that. And on the tech front, what's little known is the extent to which China is providing the technology through Tencent, through Ant Financial, through OneConnect, through many, many Asian countries. So in this period, in this space, I think for the U.S. to make a comeback, it has to rediscover its instinct and its desire for global leadership. We have to be a global collaborator again. Because for us to win, we've won in the past because we bring other people with us. And the question is, can we find our way back to that instinct where we don't win against China, we win with everybody. And right now we need to find our way back to that. And the way that I think we could do that is through a global health coalition that will prevent the next pandemic. Very quickly on Latin America. The 2 countries that have been hit hardest in terms of cases are Brazil and Peru. As you know, the leader of Brazil is in the camp of the protesters against too tight of a lockdown, while his local governors are for more of a lockdown. That's a really interesting space to watch to see where that will go. Peru, and it has 38,000 cases, 2,400 dead. Peru, 15,000 cases, 400 dead. It's the world's #2 copper producer. But what I'm watching really closely, and I'll close here, is Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't have that many cases at the moment, but this is the kind of time where tectonic plates, political tectonic plates shift. There's a call right now for a national emergency government. Venezuela has very, very few ICUs, that has very, very little ability to deal with a crisis. So you could see one of the world's, maybe the world's worst humanitarian crisis turn even worse during this period of time with political impact. So let me leave it right there, but I think we have to watch not just the health crisis, which Bret was saying, but secondarily the economic crisis, and then that economic crisis has huge geopolitical impact into what kind of a world we come out of. Obviously, I don't necessarily want it to be a Chinese-centric globalization. I'd rather it be a Western, democratic, free market-centric globalization, so I hope that's where we land.
All right. Thank you so much, Fred, for those really great comments. I'm going to actually throw it over to Cristina now, Cristina Antelo, who is the principal with Ferox Strategies. Are you there? Oh, there she is. Because I think this whole, what's going on in the political arena and everything is right sort of up in your wheelhouse. So maybe you can share with us kind of off the comments of Bret and Fred, what you're seeing and what's going on from your perspective.
Sure. Good morning. As we have been here a couple of weeks, Ferox Strategies is a Latina-owned government relations firm and have been involved in politics for well over a decade. Some of this might be a little repetitive to what Bret said, but with a little more detail, is kind of straight on the politics side. Right now in the House, they are working on phase 3.5, what we're calling. So if the original CARES Act was Corona 3 because there were two other provisions that were passed beforehand, they're now wanting to re-up the money that was included in that for all of the money that's been depleted on the PPP program. Senator Schumer, the minority leader, has confirmed this morning that he does expect that there will be a deal passed in the Senate today at about 4 p.m. during their pro forma session. Pro forma means they're not meeting in person, so that they're expecting a unanimous consent. Our staffer friends caution us that they're still writing the text, so hopefully they'll be able to get it done by 4 o'clock, but nonetheless, we expect that it will happen tonight. As part of the $5 billion package, they are requesting additional PPP funds as well as the EIDL small business aid programs, and including a national approach to testing. Schumer did say that he did have to concede to Republican demands that state and local aid. So for those of you that represent municipalities or different states, the additional monies for those programs are going to be postponed until they discuss phase 4, Corona 4, and that's not expected to come up until into May. So they don't, right now they're scheduled to return to DC May 4th. Maybe that gets pushed. In any event, consideration of Corona 4 won't happen until May. Other things that are notable, some of the banks are predicting that there is already so much pent up demand for those additional PPP funds that the re-upped program could still be re-exhausted within just a couple of days. The PPP is weathering a lot of criticism for all corners of its original design, which allowed franchisee restaurants, for example, and hospitality companies to access the program. And many of those that are deemed big companies were able to get big chunks of money that the public deemed as wasteful and not able to actually get to small businesses where they thought it was intended. Fox Business is reporting that many of those larger banks are lobbying themselves to get the rules restricted so that they can just focus on the small businesses and not necessarily be required to give to those larger businesses. From one of my sources on Capitol Hill in the Senate, we understand that the phase 3.5 bill, hopefully again that gets passed by the Senate today, will include not only the additional monies for the PPP, but $90 billion set aside for small, rural, CDFI, and other lenders that are serving the underbanked and minority businesses participating in the PPP. I assume Ramiro will be able to talk more about that. There's also going to be $60 billion for the SBA EIDL program. Those are quick access loans that a business can usually access within 3 days and about $10,000. There's also $75 billion for hospitals and another $25 billion for testing, which more and more municipalities are determining will be necessary for them to reopen. House Democratic leaders have focused and said that if that package does pass the Senate tonight, that they are hoping that they will be able to take it up on Thursday morning. There have been antics in the past, and they are fully expecting again that some of the more conservative members will require an in-person vote. So the House leadership has told everyone that they will need to fly back to Washington, D.C., and that they will not be allowed to do a vote as a unanimous consent as they are doing in the Senate. While they're here, if they are able to come to DC on Thursday, the House is taking up a vote on a rule that will allow them to use proxy voting in the future. That will mean that they will have a plan in case additional votes are required and they're not in Washington to allow for proxy voting so that in-person votes will not be required if needed. Another thing that has changed in the House, they also want to be able to get back to regular order and allow hearings. How and what that looks like is not completely sure right now, but many of the members are anxious to get to work. There are several things that are up still for consideration, including the National Defense Authorization Act, the appropriations, as well as oversight of what's happening now with all of the funds that have been put into this stimulus. I have a couple more minutes just Bret mentioned the EO for immigrations, the order by President Trump that he was going to suspend immigration. That took many administration officials by surprise. And in fact, staffers this morning are just now getting around to drafting the EO, the executive order that will temporarily halt new green cards as well as work-related visas. One more thing from President Trump has indicated that the federal government would like to offer liability waivers for sick customers or employees to private sector companies that reopen. I think that he is acknowledging that if they since he wants to open, and if they open and more people get sick, that there could be causes for lawsuits, and he wants to provide a federal backstop for employers or companies that are offering services, so that if and when they do get sued, that the federal government will back them up so that he is able to promote an opening of government.
Wow, that's great, Cristina. And I think that is a really great segue into getting on with Ramiro, who obviously is the president and CEO of the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, focusing on small businesses. And as we've heard throughout the weeks, and it seems to be getting, unfortunately, a little more dire, is those small businesses, and particularly those that are minority owned, are really struggling in this crisis. And so, you know, Ramiro, please build off of what Cristina and everyone else has said, because we really have to get to a point of understanding the situation and then figuring out what the solution is, because we obviously can't function as a society with our small businesses going under.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me, Beth, and everyone. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank all of my fellow panel members, of course, David, Bret, Cristina, and Fred, for what they've shared. I'm a panel member here to learn more than to share. And so this has been very helpful. I want to just, before I share some thoughts on small business and the importance of the programs that we're talking about with the COVID, is to, our hearts go out to Cecilia, Claudia's mother in Mexico City, for her good health and her recovery at this time. I just wanted to stress that you know, the role that we play as small business advocates, and especially when it comes to Hispanic, minority, and women-owned businesses, is so critical, because the recovery from the Great Recession of 12 years ago, half of it came from small business expansion and growth, and the other half from exports to other countries. So the point that was made earlier by Bret is so critical, that we can't isolate ourselves as a nation and close our borders to immigration or trade, because it will only imperil our economy more and more. We need to make sure that as we safeguard lives, that we also safeguard our livelihood, and the flows of commerce need to continue to play out as they have for centuries. One only needs to drive around, if you are driving around today with your mask on, that if you go by a construction site, all you see are Latinos. If you go through a meat packing plant, or the 500,000 independent restaurants that are out there, who 70% of the restaurants in America, their staffs in the kitchen are Hispanics. If you look at the healthcare workers on the front lines who deserve to get hazard pay, as Governor Cuomo has said, there are over 1 million Latinos and Latinas in our hospitals and healthcare providers every day. The energy industry, I could go on and on. Folks that are in the sciences and also providing care to emergency services. 60 million Latinos out of 339 million Americans living in this country, and 80% of those born and raised here. So the notion of not being able to access, for the 4.5 million Hispanic-owned businesses in this country that generate over $800 billion to get their fair share of the Paycheck Protection Program, is insanity. I mean, we are extremely concerned that only 52% of Hispanic-owned businesses have a banking relationship, which means, as Cristina said so capably, that many of them are still waiting to get their fair share of lending because they didn't qualify during 3.0. So we have been strong advocates to make sure that there's additional funding, at least 60 billion, upwards of 90 billion. I'm glad to hear Cristina share that number. We feel that more of our community development finance institutions and minority banks and community banks, who the first round were not playing in this space. I think the governor of Michigan said it so well, that the plane is being built as it's being flown with these programs, and many of our bankers did not have the detail about what was required in the loan documents to even do the loans in the first place. So yes, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've seen so many new things. But as we go to 3.5 with the next CARES Act, we need to make sure that we address the needs of Hispanic-owned businesses. 1 out of every 4 of our Hispanic-owned businesses are already closed. 2 out of 4 are saying that they will close on a temporary basis. They are fewer than 10 employee businesses, and many of them do not have banking relationships. So they need the help from community lending and CDFIs to make sure that their businesses survive. And guess what? Most of these businesses employ fellow Hispanics and people within their family. So this is a critical piece of America. 30 million small businesses in America, already 7.5 million shut down at this point. Many of them Latino-owned businesses is unacceptable. The economic reintegration for us is so critical that these businesses survive, and that the program that was built to protect these businesses, that the funding be made available. Last point I want to make to our panel members is that many of these businesses, because they were underbanked, only had about 27 days of liquidity, and many of them get paid late from their vendors and suppliers and vendors. So I just think it's incredibly critical that as we operate and see on an hourly basis tweets going out or legislation happening, that we do not forget that our country is built by immigrants. It is a country whose first language was Spanish after the native languages here. So in fact, we're all from elsewhere besides Native Americans. And we need to not forget that the only way we're going to recover, and if we're going to compete globally and stay the strongest economy in the world, that we realize that that vibrant Latino innovation and also the grit of being on the front lines, our farm workers every day putting food on our table, our STEM scientists, all of these leaders are now being neglected through the PPP. So we are insisting and have sent letters to the president and everyone in the administration, from Mnuchin to Jovita Carranza, and of course the chair of our Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Joaquin Castro, that it is unacceptable that these dollars go and be abused basically by corporations that are not meeting the bailout and the liquidity. This is not an insolvency problem for Latino or small businesses. It's a liquidity challenge. And we've already gone through 4 or 6 weeks of this shutdown, and many of them are still waiting. So we are demanding that our small minority and women-owned businesses, especially Hispanic-owned businesses, that they get their fair share in the new 3.5 CARES Act through the Paycheck Protection Program, and that the lending be provided to community lenders in whose communities they have greatest access to. So with that, sorry I went a little long. We are working round the clock to make sure that we restore our economy. So thank you very much to Claudia and everyone on this call for the work that you're doing, and I look forward to working with each of you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ramiro. That was, those last comments were just so dead on, and making sure that the right people get the dollars that are out there, and you're absolutely right. You know, to everyone on the panel, the whole point of this weekly webinar is to do what's really important, is to make sure the facts are on the table and that people are aware, because we can't move to action until we understand the situation we're trying to address. And one of the things I always say to Claudia is, you know, with this COVID-19 is a new set of problems arose. And a lot of the world is designed to work against a set of problems that are no longer the priority. So it's really important that you all join us every week for this, because we are helping people understand what this new set of problems is. And as it's unfolding, those problems unfold. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of you that are not just providing the information for everyone, but also looking for the solutions, because that's what we really need to get to. So with that, we are at the end of our time here. I want to once again thank this panel for their unbelievable insight and expertise, and I know it's going to make a huge difference. I want to close by saying that we all should say a prayer for Claudia and her mom and her family, and wish for her health, return to health. And Claudia will be back with us when this situation with her mom is gets to a better place. In the meantime, I will be here with you every day. So let's keep this going, because this is really an important effort that we have. So thank you, everybody.